Welcome to Jesus Changes Everything, a daily podcast dedicated to providing a fresh look at the ancient and glorious truth that Jesus not only reigns, but is busy about the business of bringing all things under subjection, that celebrates the wonder and the glory that he has been given all authority in heaven and on earth. We come now to our weekly ism segment. It's Tuesday, and today I'd like to speak about catastrophism or catastrophism. It is a catastrophic truth that I'm not sure how to pronounce it. I typically pronounce it catastrophism, but I could very well be wrong. Well, what is catastrophism? Well, it is a way of looking at typically natural history in a way that is rather distinct from a uniformitarian approach. That is, it looks at history of the universe as being wildly, powerfully impacted by moments of great catastrophic change. You know, we have another word for the opposite of this, by the way, is uniformitarianism. The catastrophist says, no, this doesn't all happen by slow, gradual, steady change, but rather happens with great conflict and whirlwinds and sudden changes. Think of it this way. Those who would affirm the theory, and I don't know if anybody still holds to this theory, but those who would hold to the theory that the dinosaurs were wiped out when a great meteor hit Earth and created a great rise of dust into the atmosphere, which blocked out the sun, which killed the plants, which then they didn't have anything to eat, and so they all died. That's a catastrophist kind of perspective on what happened there. Those of us who believe in a literal worldwide flood are embracing a catastrophic perspective. One of the ways that I think that becomes abundantly clear is when we witness a catastrophe. My friends at Answers in Genesis have done an outstanding job of showing the real-time, visible, measurable results of the eruption of Mount St. Helens that took place in my lifetime. Don't know how old you are, maybe yours as well. This active volcano in the state of Washington. And what we saw there and see there to this day is strata in the ground that wasn't there the day before, that was there the day after, that looks very much like the strata that uniformitarians argue take millennia or millions of years to happen. Now, it's not the only time that kind of embarrassing reality has taken place. I'm pretty sure this was my friend Israel Wayne who tells this story. Israel is a speaker and a writer in the homeschooling world, and a fine man. Doesn't live too far from us. Good man, just had his 11th child. And I believe I read him once telling the story that about when he took a visit to some sort of public cavern where they give tours of these underground caves. And he is standing there listening to the tour guide give the standard uniformitarian perspective, and they're looking at their stalactites and their stalagmites and saying, now, these grow slowly with the dripping of the water and the minerals that are inside the water and blah, 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 blah. And they generally grow about an inch every 200 years. The guy then asked if there was any questions, and Israel was standing on this stairway that had a metal guardrail. And he asked the guide, he said, "Now, how long has this public place been here?" And the fellow said, "Oh, we opened 40 years ago." And he said, "And is that when the staircase was put in here?" And he said, "Yes, that's when the staircase was put in here." And then Israel directed everybody's eyes and the whole crowd to this particular stalagmite that was on the actual stairs that was 8 inches tall. He said, "Well, my stars, this particular stalagmite's rather, of an outlier. If he's grown 8 inches in 40 years, and you say it takes, 400 years to go 2 inches. That is an acknowledgement that maybe catastrophism has more to say. Now, before we run out of time, I want to mention someone I've mentioned before in a Curating Your Book Library segment, and that is Immanuel Velikovsky. He was a brilliant scientist, not really in the mainstream, but he was well respected by the great men of his own day, and he was one who posited catastrophic natural history, specifically with respect to the planet Venus. And I commended to you, and I commended again, his book, Worlds in Collision, in which he explains what would have happened if this happened and that happened, and it just matches up, and it is catastrophic stuff. A comet that's planet-sized that gets too close to the sun and gets pulled into the orbit and turns into Jupiter, which makes this Earth change the direction it spins on its axis and flops the poles and things like that. So if you're interested in that, check out, if not the book itself, at least some secondary material on Immanuel Velikovsky. So that's catastrophism, radical changes suddenly happening because of catastrophes. It's time for another Atin segment, and I'm happy to report that we're coming back to Latin. We're leaving behind our brief sojourn into the Greek, though we may come back to the Greek at some future time. Today I'd like to speak about this Latin phrase, Analogia Entis. Analogia Entis, A-N-A-L-O-G-I-A, Analogia, new word, Entis, E-N-T-I-S, which being translated means analogy of being. Analogy of being. This describes one of the ways that we are able to learn things about who God is. You may remember, if you have read or even began Calvin's Institutes of the Christian Religion, that his sort of opening gambit is to affirm at one and the same time that if one would learn about God, he needs to know about man. And if he wants to know about man, he needs to learn about God. The analogy of being is a affirmation that we can know true things about God by recognizing that there is an analogy between our two beings. Now, I'm persuaded that we are wildly incapable of understanding the nature of analogy as I watch human discourse in our day. We think that analogy is the same thing as making two things the same thing. People get upset if I say, well, you are like the Nazis in this way, and they'll say, how dare you call me a Nazi? And I say, I didn't call you a Nazi. All I said is you had this particular point in common with them. I didn't call you anything. I made an analogy, and that's how analogies work. An analogy is when there is a point of overlap, but points that don't overlap. It's not, it's, what's the right word? Another way of describing it is, we argue about words, whether they always mean the same thing or whether they never mean the same thing. And the truth is that they sometimes mean the same thing, or in some ways mean the same thing. When we say that God is personal, we're not saying that his level of consciousness is the same as ours. But we are saying we both have a level of consciousness. That's part and parcel of what it means to be personal, to have a level of consciousness. When we say that God wills and that we will, we're not saying that our wills are exactly the same thing, but we are saying there is a point of contact. And so the analogy of being is a way to, again, learn things about who God is or learn things about who man is. And it stands as a bulwark to something that looks profoundly pious, but which is in fact profoundly impious, which is another Latin phrase that I'm going to give to you. This notion that God is totaliter aliter. Totalitor. New word aliter. Totaliter aliter, which means wholly other. The Swiss theologian Karl Barth was so zealous to protect and defend the idea of the transcendence of God, that God is above the created order, that he used this language of totaliter aliter, wholly other. The problem is that when you do this, when you describe God as wholly, that's W-H-O-L-L-Y, wholly other, that you are affirming that there's no point of contact. If there's no point of contact, there can be no communication. There has to be some overlap. Doesn't mean that we're partly God. It doesn't mean that he's partly creature. It does mean that in him we live and move and have our being. The analogy of being helps us grasp those points of connection, those what we would call communicable attributes, those attributes that God has that we have also in a lesser measure. We're not God. We are different from God. We are less than God. And if you really want to know where the real gap is, the center of the gap, if you will, between us and him, that place where he is most at his otherness, is that he's creator, and we're creature. He has the power of being in himself, and we do not. He is not dependent, contingent, or derived, and we are. But there's also points of contact. If this were not the case, the incarnation couldn't happen. This is the kind of big language people sometimes use, but it's not complicated. Don't be impressed when someone says God is totaliter aliter. Have the sense to say, no, wait a minute, wouldn't that mean this? Isn't there always a point of contact? Not complete overlap. We're not little gods, but there's always a point of contact. Well, today you got two for the price of one. That makes up for Proto-Evangelion when we only had Greek. Thanks for listening. I suspect that comfort food might better be called nostalgia food. There is, after all, nothing particularly comforting about macaroni and cheese or meatloaf. The value in the food isn't in the greatness of the taste, but in the memories the taste brings back. This, we think, mostly subconsciously, is what I used to eat back in the day when things were so much better. Which is why we have not just comfort food, but comfort television, comfort music, even comfort memories. Almost anything we experience when we are young, if it can be reasonably accurately recreated, can be a source of great comfort to us. My theory is that the attraction for such things, indeed for nostalgia in general, isn't necessarily that overall our lives were better then than they are now. Rather, it is because we were younger then than we are now. Refining the point still further, what we long for in our youth is, in my judgment, a lessening of the burden of responsibility. Of course, when we were young, didn't we look forward to growing older that we might enter into greater liberty, greater ability? What we didn't realize was that coming into our lives at the same time was the weight of adulthood. Liberty and responsibility are inseparably bound. A week or so ago, I had a classroom of students bemoaning the term papers that stood between them and the end of the semester. When I replied wistfully, "I remember when I had papers to write," they thought I was rubbing it in. They thought I was gleefully announcing my freedom from papers. What I really was trying to communicate is that I remember when getting papers done was about all I had to worry about. It's not that we resent being grown-ups. It's not that we want to embrace irresponsibility. Rather, we just miss walking freely without the burden. The good news is that we will one day so walk. Nostalgia, at its deepest, is longing not for our past, but for our parents' past. Nostalgia is longing for Eden, a hunger to get back to the garden, the lost paradise that haunts us, veiled by the mists of the ages. Our story, friends, reaches its climax and its denouement right back where it all began, only better. In Eden, we walked with God in the cool of the evening, at peace and beloved by Him and each other. In eternity, we will do the same. In Eden, we were naked and unashamed. In eternity, we will be the same. In Eden, the war had not yet started. In eternity, it will be fully and finally won. The good news is that all of this has already been won. What ought to comfort me is not this food or that music, but the gospel truth that Jesus is already on the other side. He is the firstborn of the new creation, and He is blazing a trail for His bride that we might follow Him there. When we are together again, we will not eat mac and cheese, but bread and wine, feasting with the Lamb, our husband. Lord, teach me to rest today in your sure and certain promises for tomorrow. You've been listening to the Jesus Changes Everything podcast, a production of Dunamis Fellowship the teaching outreach of Dr. R.C. Sproul Jr. If you've enjoyed this podcast, we encourage you to subscribe, which you can do at all the usual outlets, to tell your friends, and to spread the word. To learn more about the work of Dunamis Fellowship, please visit rcsproulJR.com and join us next time on Jesus Changes Everything.